Our scripture reading today comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. After Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come have some breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" For they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his word.
So when I was a kid, my brother and I used to go on these fishing trips with my uncle and my cousins, who were all much older than the 2 of us were. And they lived on Lake Barkley in Kentucky. I don't know if you've ever been down there, but that was where they lived. That's where we always went fishing. And over time, these annual trips became the subject of family lore. Like one of the stories that always got told year after year, even into my adulthood, was that, I always fished from the front of the boat. And apparently I was a little wild with my cast because all the other adults and my brother all huddled on the other end of the boat so they wouldn't get hooked as I was casting. The story that gets told the most, though, is about my brother. He was casting into the shore, which that's kind of how we did. We kind of were near the shore and we would cast close to the shore, and he just overcast. His lure landed up on the shore, and when he tried to reel it back in, it got caught in some brush. And when it got caught, his instinct was to yank it and to try to pull it out of there, but he was unprepared for the recoil that would happen. So as soon as he yanked, that pole flew out of his hands into the bottom of the lake. And as me, I think I was in 2nd grade at the time, I thought this was so funny to see my older brother fail. And I laughed, and I laughed, and I laughed, and I'm sure I was obnoxious enough so that he took my pole from my hands, threw it in the water, and said, "Now how do you feel about that?" And it's funny, for years, for decades, my family has told this story, and it always made me laugh that my uncle and my cousins got such a kick out of it, even though it was their poles that we both threw in the water, Those are the stories we have. I don't think we have any stories about the one that got away, about, that was this big. I do remember the first fish I ever caught. It was a catfish, an ugly looking thing. And I don't remember, I think my uncle told me it was 2 pounds. Who knows how big it was, but I remember, being disgusted by it, just like, whoa, what a ugly looking fish. And then, secondly, I remember being disappointed that we didn't keep the catfish. I didn't know, because they caught it and released it, and I was like, well, why didn't we keep it? Were you gonna eat it? No. Were you gonna clean it? No. So anyway, those are my memories of being, childhood fisher. Anyways, I was curious as I was reminiscing about my own experiences. I was like, I caught maybe a 2-pound catfish. What's the biggest fish ever caught in North America? Do you guys know? Well, the answer is a 468-pound white sturgeon. Pretty big fish. It was caught in 1983 with a rod and reel. And this is the interesting part about it. This fish, they think, was over 100 years old. It took the guy who reeled it in over 5 hours fighting to pull it in. Isn't that crazy? But that's not the biggest freshwater fish ever caught. The biggest freshwater fish ever caught was caught in Thailand, not with a rod and reel, but with a net. This fish was a Mekong catfish that weighed 644 pounds. It was over 9 feet long. It required 5 villagers working with a net to pull it in. Isn't that crazy? You want to know the biggest fish ever caught with a rod and reel? It was a great white shark that weighed 2,664 pounds, over a ton. And you can see it over on the right-hand side. It was caught in 1959 with a rod and reel. With that little slender rod and reel, this guy pulled in like a great white shark, a record that's not likely to be broken for a rod and reel. Now, the one on the left is also a great white shark. It's the biggest great white shark ever caught, over 3,000 pounds, but it wasn't caught with a rod and reel. It was caught with a rope lasso. The captain who caught this shark was, the basis of the Captain Quint in Jaws was based off of that captain. Pretty cool, huh? Now, can you imagine being out fishing and sinking something like that? Whether it's a shark or, like a 400, 300, 600 pound fish. Like, it would be the catch of a lifetime. And I'm imagining that's how the disciples felt that day, that morning on the Sea of Galilee. They'd been fishing their whole lives. I mean, it was how they earned their livelihood. And yet what happened that morning was like something they had never seen. It wasn't a singular fish, but it was the biggest haul of fish they had ever come across. Now, just to give you a little background of the fishing techniques of that day, there were 3 different nets that were often used in the commercial fishing trade. One was known as a cast net. It was a circular net that had weights along the edges and a rope in the middle, so you could cast it out, like it spread out in a big circle, and then the fisherman could pull back in the rope, and those weights would kind of close around any fish that you caught, in that net. And this cast net could be cast either from the shore or from a boat. Then there was another net called the trammel net. This was a much larger net, rectangular in shape. It had, buoys at the top, weights at the bottom, and it actually had 3 nets, 3 layers to the net. So there was, on either end, you can kind of see this, there were large diamond shapes that, large enough for the fish to swim into, but in the middle was a thin net that would catch the fish, and then they couldn't get out. And the way the trammel net worked is it required 2 boats to fish in this way. One boat would go out and they would set the trammel net parallel to the shore in deeper water. And while they set, that trammel net, the other boat would go close to the shore and would basically make a bunch of noise, splash, drive all the fish from the shore into the deeper water. And as they swam into the deeper water, they would be caught in the net. And this was typically the method of fishing that was used at nighttime, when visibility was really low. And so skilled fishermen could set and pull in a trammel net maybe up to 12 times on a given night. And then the last kind of net was a drag net, which was shaped kind of like a big U. And the way it would work is you'd have, a couple fishermen would start on the shore holding on to one end of the rope. A boat would set out and go in a big U, laying, the net at intervals. And then it would end, back at the same shore. The fishermen would disembark, and then they would all pull in that big U together. So what were the disciples doing that day, that night, when Jesus appeared to them? Well, most likely, they were using a trammel net out on the boat, out on the Sea of Galilee. In fact, in Luke's telling of the same miracle, now Luke has some differences from John. Important to note, Luke places this miracle at the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he first calls the disciples. And it appears that they were using a trammel net. They were fishing all night long, again, Trammel net fishing was something you did at night. And in Luke's telling, there was a partner boat. It says that, go to the next slide, it says they caught such a large number of fish that the disciples signaled to their partners in the other boat to come help them and pull it all in. They were trammel net fishing. However, in John's gospel, it's a little bit different. In John's gospel, he doesn't mention any other boat. Maybe that's what the disciples had been doing all night long, fishing with the trammel net, but they caught nothing. And perhaps the other boat, their partner boat, had just given up, gotten frustrated. Either way, they weren't in the story at all. When Jesus appears to them, he tells them to use a cast net. He says, cast your net on the other side of the boat. Now you can imagine the disciples thought this was crazy. We've been fishing all night long. There's no fish. And even if there were fish, a cast net is the least likely way that we're going to catch them. You know, a trammel net went all the way to the bottom of the sea. It was the proper way to fish. A cast net was small. It was just on the surface. They weren't going to catch a thing. But they did what the stranger on the beach said, and sure enough, they brought in more fish than they had ever seen in a single cast. It was astonishing. It was a miracle. Now, if you remember, as we've moved through John's gospel this winter, this spring, we've recounted that in John's gospel there are 7 signs and wonders. The number 7 was very important to John. And so just to recount, there was the turning of water into wine. There was the healing of the royal official's son. There was the walking on water, the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of the blind man, the healing of the lame man by the pool of Bethsaida, and the raising of Lazarus. Those were the 7 signs. And John used that number 7 because 7 represented completion, like the 7 days of creation. It was all that was needed. And so here's the question. If there's 7 signs and wonders, and we always talk about the 7 signs and wonders in John, then what about this story? Why would John mess up the symmetry, the completeness of 7 signs and wonders by then including an 8th one at the end of his gospel? Well, one way of thinking about it is that it's the first day of the new creation. That the 8th sign and wonder indicates that for John, that yes, the 7 signs and wonders were complete, but they're not finished. That in the new creation, after Jesus' resurrection, the signs and wonders of God's presence will continue. And indeed, in some ways, this 8th sign and wonder takes us all the way back to the very beginning. What was the first sign and wonder? Do you remember? Turning water into wine. I was expecting a little more crowd response there, but that's okay. The very first one was turning water into wine, and there are parallels, clear parallels between that miracle and this miracle. For starters, both miracles are about scarcity, right? In the first miracle, they ran out of wine, and the second one, they had no fish. Secondly, both stories, Jesus wasn't recognized. In the first story, no one knew who he was. He hadn't yet established his ministry. He wasn't known. The servants had no idea who he was, except he was Mary's son, and Mary said, do whatever he tells you to do. And the second example, the disciples had no idea who Jesus was. He was just a stranger walking along the shore, shouting out at them, asking them if they had any fish. And then in both miracles, Jesus gave what seems like nonsensical instructions without any explanation. To the servants, the water and the wine, he said, fill these ceremonial jars, these huge ceremonial jars that could hold 30 gallons, fill them up with water. Didn't explain why, just do it. And then to the disciples, he said, cast your net on the other side of the boat. Didn't say why, just do it. And in both cases, the miracles resulted in an abundance. More wine than the guests at the party could ever drink. More fish than the disciples could even pull in. So you see those connections, I hope. And in both stories, and in all of John's miracle stories, the reason we say they're signs is because they point the way to who Jesus is. Prior to the miracle, the disciples thought this was just some crazy guy on the shore giving them some random instructions. At best, they cast the net just to humor him. But once they saw the fish, they knew it was the Lord. And Simon Peter's response, I think, is so funny. Like, he instantly threw on his coat and he jumped in the water. To me, it's like Forrest Gump when he sees Lieutenant Dan. Like, just immediately jumps out of the boat, doesn't care about anything else except seeing and greeting the person he loved. And Simon Peter came to shore. And when he got to shore, he found that Jesus had already prepared a fire, coals for a fire, and wanted to have a meal. And this is the interesting part, because again, this miracle relates back to other miracles, except here, we're not focused so much on the water and the wine, but also the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember that story, Jesus told the disciples, we got 5,000 people here, give them something to eat. And what did the disciples say? We don't have anything. And again, when he asked from the shore, he didn't say, have you caught anything? He said, do you have any fish? The disciple says, no, we don't have anything. And then Jesus took and gave, the exact same verbs that were part of John 6. He took and gave. And what did he feed the 5,000? Bread and fish. Again, Jesus was reminding them who he was, that he was a Lord of abundance, a giver of plentiful gifts. And then he told Simon Peter, go on the boat, bring the rest of the fish to shore. And when I wrote the devotion on this a few weeks back, you may have remembered this, I made a big deal out of this verb, haul. Simon Peter went on the boat and he hauled the net to shore. The verb there is helko, the Greek verb helko. And the reason it's significant is because it shows up 2 other times in John's gospel. In both times where Jesus is talking about himself, he says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. And then another time he says, no one can come to the Father except those that the Father has drawn to me. And so Jesus, in some ways, is giving to Peter that work of drawing people to himself. And so after they eat, he takes Simon Peter aside, and as Miss Tracy shared in her children's moment, he gave Simon Peter a charge. Tend my sheep, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. Jesus, the good shepherd, Jesus, the master fisherman, was giving to his disciples the task of being fishers of men, the task of caring for all those that he would draw unto himself. But there's more to the story, of course, because it wasn't just giving Peter a task. He was reminding Peter of a moment he failed. If you remember the story, 3 times, Jesus asked him the same question. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Because he knew Peter 3 times had said, I don't know this man. I'm not his follower. I'm not his disciple. 3 times he asked him, not as a way of shaming Simon Peter, but a way of reminding Simon Peter who he is. So for me, this story of this conversation between Simon Peter and Jesus, it's not just a moment of commissioning. It's not just Jesus giving Simon Peter responsibility for the church. It's a moment of forgiveness and grace. It's Jesus reminding Simon Peter who he is. Simon says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And yeah, Jesus knew that Simon Peter loved him. He needed Simon Peter to know and remember that. See, I believe Jesus already knew when he called Peter that Peter was going to deny him, that Peter was going to fail in that moment, that crucible of his testing, and he still called him anyway. The point being that Jesus forgave Peter before Peter even messed up. Jesus had forgiven Peter. He needed Peter to forgive himself, to release himself from his own self-imposed prison of shame and guilt. And so 3 times he said, do you love me? And 3 times he said, I have a job for you to do. You're still part of my plan and my purpose. So you hold these 2 stories together. The first story was a story about abundance. You know, the fish, the catch that surpassed all expectation. And the second story is a story about grace and forgiveness. And you put them together and they tell us this simple truth, that there is no end to God's amazing grace and love. No matter how abundant our sin may be, no matter how deep our failure may go, God's grace goes deeper yet. There is no end to it. And so we can deny 3 times, and guess what? Jesus still loves us. We can fail again and again and again and again, and yet there's still hope that if we just listen to Jesus and cast our nets where he tells us to cast, we can still find a miraculous catch. Jesus is the giver of abundant life. He is the source of abundant grace. And we're called to trust and hope and live in that. That's what Easter is about. That's what this season of Eastertide we are invited to do. To remember who Jesus is and to trust in his grace and restoration. See, I believe every single one of us sitting here today, there's a place where he wants us to cast our nets. And I don't know where Jesus is calling you to cast your net. But to me, casting your net is an act of hope. That you're not giving up on the world. That you're not giving up on the people you love. You're not giving up on yourself. Because God hasn't given up on you. He hasn't given up on us. There is no end to his grace and love and restoration. And we are called, this is the good news, every single one of us, to tend his sheep, to care for his flock, to cast our nets so that we might still be surprised and overwhelmed by the goodness of our God, who is always, always with us. Amen.